The rain taps against my apartment window with the same rhythm it had that October night 15 years ago, when everything changed between Richard and me. I'm sitting in my kitchen holding a coffee that's gone cold, staring at the text message that arrived an hour ago. I'm back in town. Coffee tomorrow? Just like that, after 3 years of silence, Richard Gomez wants to meet. I set the phone down and close my eyes, letting the memories wash over me like that autumn rain. We were 7 when we first met, two awkward kids thrown together by circumstance when his family moved into the house next door. My mother, Helen King, had insisted I bring over a plate of her famous chocolate chip cookies as a welcome gesture. I remember standing on his front porch, clutching that plate, terrified of meeting someone new. Richard answered the door himself, this skinny boy with dark hair that stuck up in impossible directions and eyes the color of coffee beans. He looked at the cookies, then at me and said, "Do you want to see my bug collection?" That was it. No small talk, no awkward introductions, just an invitation into his world, delivered with the kind of straightforward honesty that would define our friendship for the next 2 decades. His room was a museum of curiosities. Jars lined his windowsill, each containing carefully preserved insects he'd found in the backyard. He explained each specimen with scientific precision that seemed impossible for a 7-year-old, his face lighting up as he described the iridescent wings of a beetle or the perfect symmetry of a butterfly. I was mesmerized, not by the bugs, but by the way his whole being transformed when he talked about something he loved. "You're not scared of them," he observed, watching me peer closely at a particularly large moth. "Should I be?" "Most people are. They think they're gross or creepy." I shrugged. "They're just different. Different isn't scary." He smiled then, the first real smile I'd seen from him, and I felt something shift in my chest. A warmth, a recognition, though I was too young to understand what it meant. We spent the rest of that afternoon sprawled on his bedroom floor, sharing cookies and stories, laying the foundation for what would become the most important relationship of my life. The years that followed blurred together in a montage of shared adventures. We built forts in the woods behind our houses, elaborate structures of fallen branches and stolen bed sheets that served as our private kingdoms. We collected baseball cards with religious devotion, trading duplicates and arguing over statistics with the passion of tiny economists. We taught ourselves to ride bikes on the same summer afternoon, Richard patient and encouraging as I wobbled down the sidewalk, his hands steady on my back until I found my balance. If you're watching this from somewhere in the world, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from. Drop a comment and let me know your city or country. And while you're there, hit that hype button to help boost this story. Sometimes the most personal tales are the ones that connect us across distances, and I'm grateful you're here with me as I work through this. Middle school brought new complications. Our bodies began changing in ways that felt foreign and embarrassing. And suddenly, the easy physical closeness we'd always shared became charged with an undercurrent I couldn't name. Richard grew taller first, his voice cracking at inopportune moments during our conversations. I remained stubbornly short, watching from below as he transformed into someone who looked less like the boy I'd known and more like a stranger wearing his face. We still spent every afternoon together, but something had shifted. Where before we'd thought nothing of falling asleep during sleepovers curled up together like puppies, now we maintained careful distances. Where before we'd changed clothes without a second thought, now we turned away, suddenly modest. The innocence of childhood was slipping away, replaced by an awareness that felt both thrilling and terrifying. It was during 8th grade that I first began to understand what was happening to me. We were at Richard's house, supposedly working on a science project about photosynthesis, but actually just talking and procrastinating as usual. He was lying on his stomach on the carpet, chin propped on his hands, explaining something about chlorophyll. The afternoon light streaming through his window caught the gold flecks in his brown eyes, and I found myself staring, memorizing the curve of his brow, the way his lips moved when he spoke. "Are you even listening to me?" he asked, and I realized I'd been quiet for too long. "Sorry, just thinking." "About what?" The truth sat on the tip of my tongue, dangerous and impossible. "About how your smile makes my stomach flutter, about how I've started having dreams about you that I can't tell anyone, about how I'm beginning to understand that what I feel for you isn't the same as what other boys feel for their friends. Nothing important, I said instead, and turned back to our textbook. High school amplified everything. Richard joined the debate team and discovered he had a gift for argument, for taking apart opposing positions with surgical precision. I gravitated toward the art room, finding solace in the quiet concentration of drawing and painting. We still walked to school together every morning, still sat together at lunch, but our separate interests were pulling us into different orbits. I began to notice how other boys talked about girls, the crude jokes and obvious attractions that seemed to come so naturally to them. I tried to participate, to nod along when they discussed which cheerleader had the best legs or which actress they'd want to date. But it felt like performing in a play where I'd never learned my lines, speaking a language that wasn't native to my tongue. Richard, meanwhile, seemed to navigate these social waters with ease. He dated Michelle Price junior year, a smart, pretty girl from his debate team who laughed at his jokes and shared his interest in politics. I told myself I was happy for him, that the sick feeling in my stomach when I saw them together was just normal jealousy, the kind any best friend might feel when suddenly competing for attention. But late at night, alone in my room, I couldn't lie to myself. I would stare at the ceiling and replay moments from our friendship, searching for signs I might have missed, clues that he felt something more than friendship too. The way he'd looked at me sometimes with an intensity that seemed to go beyond casual affection. The way his hand would linger when he passed me something. The way he'd grown quiet and thoughtful whenever I mentioned being interested in someone. Were these real moments of connection, or was I manufacturing meaning where none existed? The uncertainty was torture, a constant low-level anxiety that colored every interaction between us. I became hyper-aware of my own behavior, monitoring every word and gesture for signs that might give me away. The easy naturalness of our childhood friendship was replaced by a careful choreography of restraint. The summer before senior year, everything came to a head. Richard and Michelle had broken up in May, citing the usual teenage reasons of growing apart and wanting different things. He seemed relieved rather than heartbroken, which I found both encouraging and confusing. We fell back into our old patterns, spending long, lazy afternoons together. But now there was an electric tension in the air that neither of us acknowledged. We were in his backyard one evening in July, lying on a blanket and looking up at the stars. His parents were out of town, and the house behind us was dark and quiet. The night was warm and humid, the kind of summer evening that feels suspended in time. We'd been talking about college applications, our fears about leaving home, the uncertainty of what came next. "I'm scared," Richard said suddenly, his voice quiet in the darkness. "Of college? Of everything changing? Of losing this?" He gestured between us, a small movement I felt rather than saw. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. "Things don't have to change, don't they? We're going to different schools, different states. We'll make new friends, have new experiences. How do we stay the same when everything else is different?" I turned on my side to face him, though I could barely make out his features in the starlight. "We don't stay the same. We grow, but that doesn't mean we lose what matters." He was quiet for a long moment, then so softly I almost missed it. What if what matters most is something I can't even say out loud? The words hung between us like a bridge I was afraid to cross. This felt like a moment of truth, a door opening to a conversation we'd been dancing around for years. But I was 17 and terrified, paralyzed by the fear of being wrong, of ruining everything by misunderstanding. "You can tell me anything," I said, which was both true and completely inadequate. He turned toward me then, and in the dim light I could see his face, serious and vulnerable in a way I'd rarely seen. For a heartbeat, I thought he might actually say it, might voice the thing that had been growing between us like a secret garden. But then he smiled, that careful smile he'd perfected over the years, and the moment passed. "I know," he said. "I'm just being dramatic. Senior year nerves, you know." I nodded and turned back to look at the stars, swallowing the disappointment that tasted like copper in my mouth. We lay there in silence until his parents came home. Then I walked back to my own house, to my own room, to another sleepless night of wondering what might have been. Senior year passed in a blur of college applications, final exams, and the bittersweet rituals of endings. Richard got into Northwestern, his dream school, with plans to study political science. I was headed to a small liberal arts college 3 hours away, drawn by their strong art program and the promise of a fresh start. We made plans to stay in touch, to visit each other, to maintain the friendship that had defined both our childhoods. The night before graduation, we sat on the roof of his house, a tradition we'd started in middle school when we discovered we could climb out his bedroom window onto the gentle slope above the porch. The spring air was soft and warm, carrying the scent of his mother's roses from the garden below. "Remember when we first met?" Richard asked, his legs dangling over the edge of the roof. "You showed me your bug collection. You weren't scared. I thought that was so cool." "I told you different wasn't scary." He laughed, but there was something wistful in the sound. "I've been thinking about that a lot lately, about being different, about what that means." I glanced at him sideways, trying to read his expression in the dim light from the street lamp below. "Different how?" "I don't know, just different, like I don't fit the mold everyone expects me to fit." My pulse quickened. This felt like dangerous territory, the kind of conversation that could change everything between us. Part of me wanted to push, to ask the questions that had been burning in my chest for years. But the larger part, a dark part, the part that had learned to be careful, held back. "Nobody really fits the mold," I said instead. "We all just pretend we do." "Do you pretend?" The question caught me off guard. "Sometimes." "What do you pretend about?" The honest answer would have been everything. I pretended to be interested in girls when my friends talked about dating. I pretended not to notice when other boys caught my attention. I pretended that my feelings for him were normal, platonic, the kind any best friend might have. I pretended that I didn't lie awake at night imagining what it would feel like to kiss him, to tell him the truth about who I really was. "Just normal stuff," I said. "Trying to fit in, I guess." He nodded and we fell into silence. Below us, the neighborhood was quiet, most families already asleep. In a few hours, we'd put on caps and gowns and walk across the stage, officially ending this chapter of our lives. The weight of that impending change sat heavy between us. "I'm going to miss this," Richard said finally. "The roof? All of it. This house, this neighborhood. You." The simple honesty of it made my chest tight. "I'll miss you too." "Will you, really? Or will you be too busy with your new life to remember the kid next door?" I turned to face him fully then, struck by the vulnerability in his voice. "Richard, you're not just the kid next door. You're my best friend. That doesn't change because we're going to different schools." "Promise?" "Promise, Vaneo." He smiled then, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him all evening. "Good, because I don't know how to do this without you." "You won't have to. We'll figure it out." We stayed on the roof until nearly dawn, talking about everything and nothing, trying to memorize each other's voices, the cadence of our conversations, the easy comfort of being understood. When we finally climbed back through his window, exhausted and slightly giddy from the late hour, he hugged me goodbye at his bedroom door. It should have been a normal hug, the kind we'd shared thousands of times over the years. But something was different this time. He held on longer than usual, his arms tight around my shoulders, his face buried against my neck. I could feel his breath warm against my skin, could smell the familiar scent of his shampoo mixed with something else, something distinctly him. For a moment, I let myself imagine that this was more than friendship, that the tension I felt was mutual, that he was holding on because he didn't want to let me go any more than I wanted to leave. But then he stepped back, his hands lingering briefly on my arms before dropping to his sides. "See you at graduation," he said, his voice slightly rough. "See you there." I walked home in the pre-dawn darkness, my skin still tingling from where he touched me, my mind racing with possibilities I was too afraid to fully acknowledge. College was a revelation and a torment. Away from the familiar patterns of home, I began to understand myself in ways I'd been avoiding for years. My roommate, Paul Rodriguez, was openly gay, the first person I'd ever known who lived that truth without apology. He talked about his boyfriend back home with the same casual affection other boys had always reserved for their girlfriends. And slowly, through his example, I began to see that there might be a way to live authentically. But understanding myself and acting on that understanding were two different things. I was still the careful boy who'd learned to monitor every word and gesture, still terrified of rejection, still clinging to the hope that maybe, somehow, Richard felt the same way I did. We talked on the phone every week, long conversations that left me both satisfied and aching. He seemed happy at Northwestern, thriving in his classes and making new friends. He mentioned dating a few times, casual references to going out with classmates that made my stomach clench with jealousy. I threw myself into my art, finding in painting and sculpture a way to express the emotions I couldn't voice. My professors praised my work for its emotional depth, its exploration of themes around identity and belonging. If they noticed that many of my pieces seemed to be about longing, about connection just out of reach, they were kind enough not to comment directly. Spring break of freshman year, we both came home to visit our families. It had been 8 months since we'd seen each other in person, and I was nervous about how it would feel to be in the same room again. Would the distance have changed things between us? Would I be able to hide what I was beginning to understand about myself? Richard picked me up at my parents' house on the second day I was home, suggesting we drive to our old elementary school to walk around and reminisce. It was a warm April afternoon, the kind of day that made everything feel possible. He looked good, older somehow, more confident in his own skin. College had been good to him. We walked the familiar hallways of our childhood, laughing at how small everything seemed now, how young the current students looked. We sat on the swings where we'd spent countless recesses, talking about our classes, our friends, our plans for the future. It felt like coming home and saying goodbye at the same time. I have something to tell you, Richard said as we were driving back to our neighborhood. His voice was different, more serious than it had been all afternoon. My heart started racing. What is it? He pulled over at the park where we'd spent so many summer afternoons, turning off the engine but leaving the radio playing softly. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. I've been thinking a lot this year about who I am, what I want. College has been good for that, being away from everything familiar, having space to figure things out. I nodded, not trusting my voice. I've been dating someone, he continued, and my heart sank. His name is Stephen Jackson. He's in my political science program. The world tilted sideways. He'd said his. Richard was dating a boy. I know this might be weird for you, he continued, misreading my silence. I know it changes things between us, probably, but I couldn't keep pretending anymore. I couldn't keep lying about who I am. I stared at him, this boy I'd known my entire life, who was suddenly revealing a truth I'd never dared hope for. He was gay. He was dating someone, and he was terrified I would reject him for it. Richard, I started, then stopped, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the moment. I understand if you need time to process this, he said quickly. I know it's a lot. I just couldn't keep it secret anymore, especially from you. You're too important to me. How long have you known? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Honestly, I think I've always known deep down. But I was scared of what it meant, what people would think, what you would think. I turned to look at him fully, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time. The careful distance he'd maintained in high school, the way he'd seemed relieved rather than heartbroken when he and Michelle broke up, the vulnerability in his voice that night on the roof when he'd talked about being different. I could never think less of you for being honest about who you are, I said finally. The relief on his face was palpable. Really? Really, I'm proud of you for having the courage to live authentically. We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the last light fade from the sky. I wanted to tell him then, wanted to share my own truth, to bridge the gap between us completely. But something held me back. Maybe it was the mention of Stephen, the reminder that Richard had moved on, found someone else. Maybe it was the fear that my feelings were too complicated, too tied up in our history to be fair to either of us. Thank you, Richard said eventually, for understanding, for still being my friend. Always, I promised, and meant it, even as my heart was breaking just a little. The rest of college passed in a strange kind of limbo. Richard and I maintained our friendship, but something fundamental had shifted. He was open about his relationship with Stephen, sharing stories about their life together with the same ease he'd once reserved for talking about classes or family news. I was happy for him, genuinely, but each conversation left me feeling more isolated, more aware of my own cowardice. I dated a few people during those years, mostly women, trying to convince myself that maybe I'd been wrong about my own sexuality. But every relationship felt like a performance, a careful imitation of something I'd observed rather than something I truly felt. The connections were pleasant but hollow, missing the depth of emotion I'd experienced just thinking about Richard. Junior year, I finally came out to Paul, my roommate who'd been patiently waiting for me to figure myself out. He listened without judgment as I told him about my confusion, my fear, my certainty that I was gay, coupled with my inability to act on that knowledge. "You know you don't have to have it all figured out right away," he said gently. "Coming out isn't a one-time event. It's a process, and everyone does it at their own pace." I feel like such a coward. You feel like someone who's been careful with his heart. That's not the same thing. Through Paul's encouragement, I began to explore the gay community on campus, attending meetings of the LGBTQ student organization, making friends who understood the particular challenges of coming to terms with your identity. Slowly, I began to build a sense of self that felt authentic rather than performed, but I still couldn't bring myself to tell Richard. Our friendship had found a new equilibrium, and I was terrified of disrupting it again. He seemed happy with Stephen, settled in a way I'd never seen him before. What right did I have to complicate that with my own unresolved feelings? Senior year brought the pressure of post-graduation plans. Richard was applying to law schools, following his passion for politics and social justice. I was considering graduate programs in fine arts, though part of me wondered if I was just avoiding the real world for a few more years. We made tentative plans to stay in touch after graduation, but both of us knew it would be different. We were adults now, with separate lives and separate futures. The last time I saw Richard during college was at his graduation. I drove up to Northwestern for the ceremony, sitting with his parents in the audience as he walked across the stage. He looked proud and confident, ready for whatever came next. At the party afterward, I met Stephen for the first time, a tall, serious boy with kind eyes and an easy laugh. He was clearly devoted to Richard, and Richard glowed in his presence in a way that was both beautiful and painful to witness. "You must be the famous childhood friend," Stephen said when Richard introduced us. "I've heard so many stories about you. All good ones, I hope." "The best. Richard talks about you like your family." Family. The word sat strangely in my chest. It was true in a way. Richard and I had grown up together, shared formative experiences, knew each other in ways that went deeper than most friendships. But family implied a permanence, a bond that couldn't be broken by distance or time or unspoken truths. I wasn't sure that's what we were anymore. Richard and Stephen were moving to Chicago together, where Richard would attend law school and Stephen would start a job at a nonprofit. I was headed to graduate school in California, as far from them as I could get while still staying in the continental United States. It felt like a natural breaking point, a chance for all of us to move forward into our adult lives without the complications of our shared past. The night before I left for California, Richard called me. We talked for hours, reminiscing about our childhood, making promises to stay in touch, acknowledging that things would be different now, but insisting that our friendship would endure. It was a sweet conversation, full of affection and nostalgia, but it felt like a goodbye in a way that previous separations hadn't. "Take care of yourself out there," Richard said as we were winding down. "You too." "And Richard?" "Yeah. I'm really proud of who you've become. You're living your own truth, and that takes courage." There was a pause, and when he spoke again, his voice was soft. "Thank you. That means everything, coming from you." After we hung up, I sat in my childhood bedroom, surrounded by boxes of belongings I was taking to my new life, and allowed myself to cry. Not just for Richard, though that was part of it, but for the boy I'd been, the one who'd been too afraid to speak his truth when it might have mattered. I was 22 years old, finally beginning to understand who I was, but it felt like I was already too late. Graduate school in California was exactly what I needed. The distance from everything familiar forced me to build a new identity from scratch, one based on authenticity rather than careful performance. I came out fully during my first semester, joining the graduate student LGBTQ group, dating men openly for the first time in my life. It was terrifying and liberating in equal measure. My art evolved during those years, becoming more personal, more honest. I created a series of paintings about memory and loss, about the gap between what we feel and what we're able to express. My advisor, a renowned sculptor named Eugene King, pushed me to dig deeper, to find the emotional core of my work and build everything else around that truth. Art is about vulnerability, he told me during one of our critiques. The pieces that matter, the ones that last, they're the ones where the artist has stripped away all the protective layers and shown us something real. I thought about that advice often, especially when I was working on pieces that dealt with themes of love and longing. There was one painting in particular, a portrait of two figures reaching toward each other across a vast space, their fingers almost but not quite touching. I'd painted it thinking about Richard, about all the moments when we'd come close to honesty but pulled back at the last second. Richard and I exchanged emails sporadically during those years, brief updates about our lives that maintained the connection without requiring too much emotional investment. He was thriving in law school, making good grades, and getting involved in civil rights advocacy. Stephen had proposed during their second year in Chicago, and they were planning a small wedding for the following summer. The news should have been purely happy for me, but it carried an undertone of finality that left me feeling hollow. I didn't attend their wedding. I sent a gift and a heartfelt note, claiming that I couldn't get away from my thesis work, which was technically true, but not the whole truth. The whole truth was that I wasn't ready to watch Richard commit his life to someone else, even though I genuinely wanted him to be happy. It felt cowardly, but it also felt necessary for my own emotional well-being. After I finished my MFA, I moved to Portland, drawn by the city's vibrant art scene and its reputation for accepting people who didn't quite fit conventional molds. Found work teaching art classes at a community college, and rented a small studio where I could continue my own creative practice. It was a good life, quiet and fulfilling in its own way. But there was always an underlying sense of incompleteness, as if I were living a carefully curated version of myself rather than the full truth. I dated several men during my years in Portland, some relationships lasting a few months, others barely making it past a few dates. There was Frank Mendoza, a writer I met at a coffee shop who shared my love of literature and long conversations about art. We dated for almost a year, and for a while I thought it might develop into something serious. But there was always a distance between us that I couldn't bridge. A part of myself I held back even when I wanted to be fully present. "You're always somewhere else," Frank said the night we broke up. "Even when you're here, you're thinking about someone or something else." He wasn't wrong. Part of me was always thinking about Richard, wondering what he was doing, whether he was happy, if he ever thought about our childhood with the same mixture of fondness and regret that colored my memories. I followed his career from a distance, reading articles about his work with a civil rights organization, seeing photos from his social media accounts that showed a life well lived. He looked happy, settled, complete in a way I envied. It was during my 5th year in Portland that I received the news that would change everything. My mother called on a Tuesday evening, her voice careful in the way it got when she was trying not to upset me. "I ran into Helen Gomez at the grocery store today," she said, referring to Richard's mother. "She told me that Richard and Stephen are getting divorced." The words hit me like a physical blow. Divorced, but they just got married. "It's been 3 years, honey, and apparently it's been coming for a while. Helen said they grew apart, wanted different things. Richard's moving back here next month. He's taking a job with a firm downtown." After we hung up, I sat in my studio surrounded by my paintings, trying to process this information. Richard was getting divorced. Richard was moving home. Richard would be living in the same city where we'd grown up, probably visiting the same places we'd explored together as children. The rational part of my mind knew that his divorce had nothing to do with me, that people grew apart for all kinds of reasons, that 3 years was actually a reasonable length for a marriage that wasn't working. But the part of me that had never stopped loving him couldn't help but wonder if this was some kind of sign, a second chance at something we'd never quite managed to grasp the first time around. I didn't reach out to Richard immediately after learning about his divorce. It felt presumptuous, like I'd be taking advantage of his vulnerability. Instead, I waited, continuing my life in Portland, while part of my mind remained focused on the fact that he was now geographically closer than he'd been in years. 2 months later, he reached out to me. It was a simple email sent late on a Sunday night with the subject line, "Long time no talk." "I know it's been forever since we've been in touch," he wrote, "but I'm going through some major life changes and I keep thinking about old friends, about the people who knew me before I became whoever I am now. I'm back in our hometown, if you can believe it, working at Morrison and Associates downtown. I know you're in Portland, which isn't exactly next door, but it's closer than Chicago. If you're ever in the area, I'd love to catch up." I read the email 3 times before responding, crafting and deleting several drafts before settling on something that struck the right balance between warmth and casualness. I told him I was sorry to hear about his divorce, that I hoped he was doing okay, that I'd love to see him if I found myself in the area. It was safe, friendly, the kind of response that kept doors open without making any commitments. His reply came the next day. "Thanks for understanding about the divorce. It's been rough, but probably for the best in the long run. Stephen and I wanted different things, and we figured that out before we made each other completely miserable. I'm actually doing okay, all things considered. The job is good, and it's nice being close to family again." We began emailing regularly after that, tentative at first, then with increasing frequency and openness. He told me about his work, about adjusting to single life, about rediscovering the city we'd grown up in through adult eyes. I shared stories about my teaching, my art, the rhythm of life in Portland. It felt like rebuilding a friendship from the ground up, finding new ways to connect while honoring the history we shared. 3 months into our renewed correspondence, Richard mentioned that he was planning to visit Portland for work, a legal conference that would keep him in the city for a long weekend. Did I want to get dinner while he was in town? My first instinct was to say yes immediately, but I forced myself to think it through. Seeing Richard again after so many years, knowing what I knew about myself now, understanding the feelings I'd carried for him all these years, was I ready for that? Could I handle being in the same room with him without all my carefully constructed emotional walls crumbling? But the alternative was continuing to live in this strange limbo, forever wondering what might happen if we actually saw each other again. And maybe, after all these years, I was finally ready to find out. "I'd love to have dinner," I wrote back. "I know a great place downtown that I think you'd enjoy." The weeks leading up to his visit passed in a blur of nervous energy. I found myself paying more attention to my appearance, updating my wardrobe, getting a haircut that was more flattering than my usual practical style. Cleaned my apartment obsessively, even though there was no plan for him to see it. I was acting like a teenager preparing for a first date, which was both ridiculous and painfully accurate. The night before he was supposed to arrive, I barely slept. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, running through possible scenarios in my mind. What if the chemistry we'd had as children was completely gone? What if we had nothing to talk about? What if seeing him confirmed that I'd been holding on to a fantasy all these years? That the Richard I'd been in love with existed only in my memory? Or worse, what if seeing him brought all those feelings rushing back with the same intensity they'd had when we were 18, when we were 22, when I'd been too afraid to act on them? The restaurant I'd chosen was a small Italian place in the Pearl District, intimate enough for real conversation, but public enough to feel safe. I arrived 15 minutes early and sat at our reserved table, fidgeting with my napkin and checking my phone obsessively. When Richard walked through the door, my breath caught in my throat. He looked like himself, but refined, polished in the way that comes with professional success and personal confidence. His hair was shorter than he'd worn it in college, and there were fine lines around his eyes that spoke of laughter and stress in equal measure. He was wearing a dark suit that fit him perfectly, and when he smiled at me across the restaurant, I felt 15 years fall away in an instant. "You look good," he said as he sat down across from me, and I realized I'd been staring. "So do you. Very lawyer-like." He laughed, and the sound was exactly as I remembered it, warm and genuine and slightly self-deprecating. "I clean up okay when I have to." The first hour passed easily, filled with the kind of catching-up conversation that allowed us both to relax into each other's presence. He told me about his vol, about the cases he was working on, about the strange experience of being back in our hometown as an adult. I shared stories about my students, about the local art scene, about the life I'd built for myself in Portland. But underneath the surface conversation, there was an undercurrent of awareness, a recognition that we were both carefully avoiding certain topics. His divorce, my dating life, the years of silence between us, the reasons we'd drifted apart in the first place. It was over dessert that the conversation finally turned more personal. Richard had ordered tiramisu, and watching him eat it brought back a sudden, vivid memory of sharing desserts as children. The way we'd always split everything down the middle, the unconscious intimacy of eating from the same plate. "Can I ask you something, Oma?" he said, setting down his fork. "Of course, Fahashuam. Why didn't you come to my wedding?" The question caught me off guard, even though part of me had been expecting it all evening. I'd prepared several answers over the years, all of them technically true, but none of them completely honest. "I was in the middle of my thesis defense," I said. "The timing was just impossible." He nodded, but I could see in his eyes that he didn't entirely believe me. "I missed you there. It felt strange, celebrating something that important without you." "I'm sorry, I wanted to be there." "Did you, really?" The simple question hung between us, loaded with implications I wasn't sure I was ready to unpack. This was the moment I'd been avoiding for 15 years, the conversation that could either bridge the gap between us or widen it irreparably. "It's complicated," I said finally. "Most important things are." I took a sip of wine, buying myself time to think. Richard was watching me with the same patient attention he'd given to his bug collection all those years ago, waiting for me to find the words for something difficult. "I was happy for you," I said slowly. "I genuinely wanted you to be happy, but I also knew that watching you marry someone else would be hard for me, and I wasn't sure I could handle that gracefully." "Hard how?" This was it, the moment of truth I'd been avoiding since we were teenagers. I could deflect again, give him another partial answer, maintain the careful distance that had defined our adult friendship, or I could finally tell him the truth and deal with whatever consequences followed. "Because I was in love with you," I said quietly. I had been for years. Richard went very still. His fork was halfway to his mouth, suspended in the air between us like a question mark. For a long moment, the only sound was the quiet chatter of other diners and the soft jazz playing over the restaurant's sound system. "Was?" he asked finally. The single word contained multitudes. Was, as in past tense, something I'd moved beyond. Was, as in he was hoping it was no longer true. Was, as in he was disappointed that it might no longer be true. I corrected, my voice barely above a whisper. "I am in love with you. I have been since we were kids, and I was too scared to tell you. And then you came out, and I thought maybe I'd have a chance, but you were with Steven, and I didn't want to complicate things for you, Bo. And then you got married, and I knew I'd missed my opportunity completely." The words tumbled out in a rush, 15 years of suppressed truth finally finding their way into the world. I felt simultaneously terrified and relieved, like I just stepped off a cliff and was waiting to see whether I'd crash or fly. Richard set down his fork with deliberate care. His face was unreadable, a careful mask that reminded me of the boy who'd learned to hide his feelings behind politeness and distance. "You were scared," he said slowly. "Terrified." "Of what?" "Of losing you, of ruining our friendship, of being wrong about what I thought I saw between us." He leaned back in his chair, and I could see him processing this information, fitting it into the narrative of our shared history. "What did you think you saw?" "Moments, looks, the way you held on to me that night before graduation, the way you talked about being different, about not fitting the mold. I thought maybe you felt something too, but I was never sure enough to risk it. And now? Now I'm 37 years old, and I've spent 15 years wondering what might have happened if I'd been braver. I've had relationships, but none of them felt like what I imagined it could feel like with you. And I know this is terrible timing with your divorce and everything, and I'm not asking for anything from you. I just needed you to know the truth. Richard was quiet for a long time, his hands folded on the table between us. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft but steady. I did feel something, back then I mean. I was attracted to you, emotionally and physically, but I was so confused about my sexuality that I couldn't separate what I felt for you from what I felt about being gay in general. You were safe, familiar, and I think part of me was afraid that my feelings for you were just about that safety rather than genuine attraction. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure the other diners could hear it. And now I think I was an idiot. Now I think we were both so busy protecting ourselves that we missed something that could have been beautiful. The words hung between us like a bridge, an invitation to cross the distance we'd maintained for so long. But there was still the matter of timing, of his recent divorce, of the practical complications of living in different cities and rebuilding a connection after so many years apart. What does that mean? I asked. I don't know, he said honestly. I'm still figuring out who I am post-divorce, still adjusting to being single again. And you have a life in Portland, a career, probably relationships I don't know about. No relationships, not serious ones anyway. Why not? I smiled, feeling lighter than I had in years despite the uncertainty of the moment. Because I was in love with someone else. We left the restaurant and walked through the quiet streets of downtown Portland, neither of us ready to end the conversation or return to our separate spaces. The night was clear and cool, the kind of Pacific Northwest evening that made the city feel intimate and full of possibility. I have a confession, Richard said as we paused at a crosswalk. I looked you up online before I came here. Your art, I mean. I found your website, looked at your paintings. What did you think? They're beautiful and sad. There's this underlying sense of longing in all of them, like you're always reaching for something just out of grasp. I thought about the painting in my studio, the two figures stretching toward each other across an impossible distance. Art is supposed to be honest. Is that what you've been feeling all these years? Like you were reaching for something you couldn't have? Yes. He stopped walking and turned to face me fully. We were standing under a streetlight, and in its warm glow, he looked like the boy I'd fallen in love with and the man he'd become, past and present, layered together in a way that made my chest tight with emotion. I'm sorry, he said. I'm sorry we were both too scared to be honest with each other. I'm sorry you've been carrying this alone for so long. I'm sorry, too. Sorry I wasn't braver when it might have mattered. It matters now. The simple statement hung between us, full of possibility and uncertainty. We were both different people than we'd been at 18, at 22, even at 30. We'd lived separate lives, had separate experiences, learned separate lessons about love and loss, and the courage it takes to be vulnerable. But standing there under the streetlight, I could feel the connection that had always existed between us, stronger now for having survived so many years of distance and silence. What happens now? I asked. I don't know. I go back to work tomorrow, fly home on Sunday. You go back to your life here, but maybe we don't let another 15 years pass without being honest with each other. I'd like that. Me too. We started walking again, slower now, as if we could stretch out the evening indefinitely. Richard told me more about his divorce, about the slow realization that he and Stephen wanted different things from life, different kinds of intimacy and connection. It hadn't been dramatic or angry, just a gradual recognition that they were better as friends than as husbands. The hardest part, he said, was admitting that I'd never felt about him the way I thought I should. I loved him, but I was never in love with him the way he deserved. He knew it too, eventually. That must have been painful for both of you. It was, but it was also a relief in a strange way. We were both pretending to feel something we didn't, trying to make a relationship work through sheer force of will. When we finally admitted it wasn't working, it felt like we could both breathe again. I understood that feeling, the exhaustion of performing emotions you don't actually feel. What made you realize it? Therapy, mostly. In time. But also, I kept thinking about what it felt like to be with someone I was genuinely attracted to, emotionally and physically. And I realized I'd never felt that way about Stephen. Not really. Have you felt that way about anyone? He glanced at me sideways, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. I think I felt that way about you, back then, I mean, but I was too confused and scared to recognize it for what it was. We'd reached the hotel where he was staying, a boutique place in the arts district that I'd recommended when he'd asked for suggestions. We stood on the sidewalk outside, neither of us quite ready to say goodbye. This has been the best evening I've had in months, Richard said, maybe years. For me too. Can I see you again before I leave? Maybe we could have coffee tomorrow if you're free. I'm free. Good, I'll text you in the morning. He stepped closer then, and for a moment I thought he might kiss me. The possibility hung between us, electric and terrifying. But instead, he pulled me into a hug, the same kind of embrace we'd shared as children, but charged now with adult awareness and 15 years of unspoken longing. Thank you, he whispered against my ear, for being brave enough to tell me the truth. Thank you for not running away when you heard it. He laughed softly. I've done enough running for one lifetime. When he pulled back, his hands lingered on my arms for just a moment longer than friendship required. Then he stepped away, gave me one last smile, and disappeared into the hotel lobby. I walked home through the quiet streets, my mind racing with everything that had happened, everything that had been said and left unsaid. The careful walls I'd built around my feelings for Richard had crumbled completely, leaving me vulnerable but also strangely hopeful. We'd finally told each other the truth, acknowledged the connection that had always existed between us. Where that would lead, I didn't know, but for the first time in years, I felt like I was moving towards something rather than away from it. The next morning, Richard texted me early, asking if I wanted to meet for coffee at a place near his hotel. I arrived to find him already there, sitting at a corner table with 2 cups and a plate of pastries. He looked tired but more relaxed than he had the night before, as if telling the truth had lifted a weight he'd been carrying. I didn't sleep much, he said as I sat down across from him. Neither did I. Good dreams or bad dreams? Confusing dreams, dreams where we were kids again, but we knew everything we know now. He smiled. I had similar dreams, dreams where we were braver, where we said the things we were thinking instead of keeping them to ourselves. We talked for 2 hours, the conversation flowing easily between past and present, memory and possibility. He told me more about his work, about the civil rights cases he was passionate about his plans to maybe start his own practice eventually. I shared more about my art, about the series I was working on, about my students and the satisfaction I found in teaching. But underneath the surface conversation, there was a current of something deeper, an awareness that we were negotiating the terms of a new relationship, figuring out how to be honest with each other after so many years of careful distance. I've been thinking, Richard said as we were finishing our coffee, about what you said last night, about timing and geography and all the practical complications. And? And I think we've already wasted enough time worrying about practical complications. I'm not saying we should make any grand gestures or life-changing decisions right now, but maybe we could try being honest with each other and see where that leads. What does that look like, practically speaking? I don't know. Phone calls, emails, visits when we can manage them. Getting to know each other as adults instead of holding on to the memory of who we were as kids. And if it doesn't work out, if we try this and realize we're better as friends, then we'll have tried. And we'll know instead of spending the rest of our lives wondering. The simplicity of it was both appealing and terrifying. After 15 years of overthinking every interaction between us, the idea of just seeing what happened felt revolutionary. Okay, I said, let's try. His smile was radiant, transforming his entire face in a way that reminded me of the boy who'd shown me his bug collection all those years ago. Really? Really. But we take it slow, figure things out as we go. No pressure, no expectations beyond honesty. Agreed. He reached across the table and took my hand, a simple gesture that sent electricity up my arm. His fingers were warm, slightly calloused from weekend gardening he had mentioned, familiar and foreign at the same time. This is weird, I said, looking down at our joined hands. Good weird or bad weird? Good weird, scary weird, like we're finally doing something we should have done years ago. We are. We sat like that for a long moment, hands linked across the small table, both of us marveling at the simple intimacy of touch after so many years of careful distance. Other customers came and went around us, but I felt like we existed in our own bubble, a space outside of time where anything was possible. Richard's flight wasn't until evening, so we spent the rest of the day together. I took him to some of my favorite places in the city, the art museum where I'd spent countless hours studying technique and composition, the park where I went to think and sketch, the bookstore where I'd discovered some of my favorite authors. It felt like sharing my life with him in a way I'd never been able to do before, showing him who I'd become in the years we'd been apart. At the bookstore, he bought a collection of poetry by a local author I'd recommended, and I found myself imagining him reading it on the plane, thinking about our day together. The thought made me ridiculously happy, this evidence that our time together would extend beyond his physical presence in the city. I should probably head back to the hotel soon, he had said as we were walking along the river in the late afternoon. Get packed, catch my flight. The reminder of his departure hit me harder than I'd expected. We just found each other again, just started to explore what might be possible between us, and now he was leaving. The geography that had kept us apart for so long was reasserting itself. This doesn't have to be goodbye, he said, reading the expression on my face. This is just the beginning. I know, it's just hard after yesterday and today to go back to emails and phone calls. Then maybe we don't go back to just emails and phone calls. Maybe we figure out ways to see each other more often. How? I don't know yet, but I'm motivated to figure it out. We stopped walking and faced each other, the river flowing quietly behind us. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that reflected off the water. It was beautiful and romantic, in exactly the kind of moment I'd dreamed about for years. Can I kiss you? Richard asked softly. The question I'd been hoping for and dreading in equal measure. Once we crossed that line, there would be no going back to the careful friendship we'd maintained. We'd be in uncharted territory, with all the possibility and risk that implied. Yes, I said, and stepped closer to him. The kiss was everything I'd imagined, and nothing like I'd expected. Soft and tentative at first, then deeper as we both relaxed into it. His lips were warm and slightly chapped, and he tasted like coffee and possibility. It was my first kiss with him, but it felt like coming home, like finally speaking a language I'd been trying to learn my entire life. When we broke apart, we stayed close, foreheads touching, breathing the same air. I could feel his heart beating against my chest, quick and strong. Wow, he said softly. Yeah, that was worth waiting 15 years for. I laughed, feeling giddy and overwhelmed and more hopeful than I'd been in years. Just 15 years? I feel like I've been waiting my whole life. Me too. We kissed again, longer this time, less tentative. I let myself get lost in the sensation, in the reality of Richard's arms around me, his mouth on mine, the dream I'd carried for so long finally becoming real. When we finally pulled apart, the sun had set completely, and the city lights were beginning to twinkle around us. I really do have to go, he said reluctantly. I know, but this isn't ending. This is just beginning. Promise? Promise, Wise. He walked me to my car, and we kissed one more time before I got in. I watched him walk back toward his hotel, this man I'd loved for most of my life, who'd finally kissed me first, who'd given me permission to hope for something I thought was impossible. The drive home passed in a blur. I felt like I was floating, like the laws of physics had been temporarily suspended. In the span of 24 hours, everything had changed. The careful distance Richard and I had maintained, the unspoken feelings we'd carried, the assumption that we'd missed our chance. All of it had been swept away by honesty and courage and the simple act of finally telling the truth. Now, 3 months later, I'm sitting in my kitchen with his text message, and I realize that everything I felt that night in Portland was just the beginning. We've talked every day since then, long conversations that have helped us navigate the transition from friends to something more. He's visited twice, and I've made the trip to our hometown once, staying in a hotel but spending most of my time at his apartment, learning the rhythms of his adult life. It's been complicated and wonderful and sometimes frustrating, trying to build a relationship across state lines while also processing 15 years of suppressed feelings. But it's also been the most honest I've ever been with another person, the most myself I've ever been in a relationship. The rain against my window has gentled to a soft patter, and I pick up my phone to respond to his message. Coffee sounds perfect, I type. There's something I want to talk to you about too. Because there is something I want to discuss with him. Something I've been thinking about for weeks. My lease in Portland is up for renewal next month, and for the first time in years, I'm considering a change. There's a teaching position open at the community college in our hometown, and several galleries have expressed interest in representing my work. It would mean leaving the life I've built here, but it would also mean being in the same city as Richard, seeing where this relationship could go without the complication of distance. It's a big decision, one that would have terrified the careful boy I used to be, but I'm not that boy anymore. I'm a man who's learned the value of taking risks, of being brave enough to reach for what I want instead of protecting myself from disappointment. Richard was right that night in Portland when he said we'd wasted enough time worrying about practical complications. We're both in our late 30s now, old enough to know that love is rare and precious, that the connections that matter are worth fighting for. We've already lost 15 years to fear and silence. I don't want to lose any more. Tomorrow when we meet for coffee, I'll tell him about the job opportunity, about my thoughts on moving home. I don't know what he'll say, how he'll feel about the possibility of me being a permanent part of his daily life instead of a weekend visitor. But I know he'll be honest with me, the way we've learned to be honest with each other. The boy who was too scared to speak his truth has grown into a man who understands that the biggest risk is not taking any risks at all. Richard kissed me first that evening by the river, but I'm ready to take the next step, to be the one who reaches across the distance between us and says, let's try building something together. Outside, the rain has stopped completely, and I can see stars beginning to appear between the clouds. It feels like a good omen, like the weather is clearing just in time for a new beginning. I finish my coffee and head to bed, already planning what I'll wear tomorrow, already imagining the look on Richard's face when I tell him I'm ready to come home.